Welcome to this App Ventures presentation. My name is Peter Thompson. In this presentation, we're looking at managing content load in presenting and training. In a moment, we'll look at something that many of us may have been guilty of in the past. If you've been working in an organisation for more than a couple of months, you will almost certainly have been subjected to something like what you'll see in a moment. By the way, it's not rude or gratuitously violent, but it is something horrible. It's the standard slide you can see in many places. There's often a long heading, and a logo, and some more branding. And then it goes something like this. Now, allow me to use up an extraordinary portion of your day and your highly valuable time by reading out a huge amount of stuff that you could read for yourself. Of course, we could send the slides to you by email. I'm not reading this very well, am I? But although, and on it goes. Now, many of us might have inflicted slides like this on people in the past. However, as if the excruciating experience of sitting through a session like that wasn't enough, we now have good, solid research that tells us that slides like that not only do not help people learn, they actually get in the way of learning, especially if the presenter reads them while the audience is trying to read. So from now on, there is no excuse really for creating slides like that. Why? Because we're dealing with people's working memory. And working memory has capacity limitations. To help you understand these limitations, let's think about this. If I were to read out a string of numbers at a steady pace, how many do you think you would be able to remember? Say, for example, 0, 2, 9, 6, 6, 7, 4, 3, 2, 1, and maybe even a whole lot more. What if I asked if you could remember 50 numbers? Although there are some people who can remember a large series of numbers, very few mind you, most people can remember only a few. In 1956, there was a landmark paper published by George Miller. In its title, it has the words, "The Magical Number." Put simply, Miller was investigating the capacity limitations of working memory. Thinking for a moment about a unit of information being called a chunk, the interest was in the number of chunks of information we can hold in working memory. A chunk might be a single digit or a word, or maybe even more. In any case, he proposed that the magical number was 7, plus or minus 2. If you recall the number remembering exercise on the previous slide, most people would be able to hold between 5 and 9 numbers in working memory. Some research suggests that, in fact, the number might be as low as 4. Now, why is it called the magical number? Well, let's look at the notion of a chunk again. We said that a chunk could be a single digit, for example, or a word, which is bigger, in a sense, than a single digit. So what we know is that the chunk size can grow. So let's look at those numbers again. Before we do anything with them, let me ask you this question. Even with all our gadgets like smartphones, can you still remember 5 phone numbers? Even if you've taken to relying on your phone's memory, we do know that, with practice, you could easily remember 5 phone numbers. To see how, let's arrange those numbers a bit. Now, the numbers are in chunks of 10 digits. But let's rearrange them a bit more. Does that look a bit more familiar in form, and maybe feel more comfortable? These could be phone numbers, an area code followed by 2 chunks of 4. That's how we chunk, that is, organise phone numbers to help remember them. We also associate them with names we know. So, by organising strings of numbers into manageable chunks and making meaningful associations, we can remember these strings of numbers. By the way, if you can remember 5 phone numbers, and if you write all 5 down and count the number of digits, how many digits can you remember? Well, there will be up to 50 digits. So with memory practice, we can easily remember large strings of numbers if they have been chunked and linked with meaningful associations. So, knowing that our working memories can only effectively work with a small number of chunks, this gives us some important questions to think about. One obvious question is, what does need to go on the slide? However, I offer the suggestion that, many times, a far more useful question will be, what does not need to go on the slide? By the way, the same question can be applied to written documents, diagrams on paper, and e-learning videos. One of the best ways of working with slides is, when appropriate, use images with minimal labeling and work with the image to bring it alive for your audience. Remember, to help people learn, we have to help them manage their memory. And we have 2 types of memory, broadly speaking, working and long-term. And we have to help facilitate getting stuff from working memory into long-term memory, and vice versa. Encoding and retrieval. To do that, we have to manage people's attention. There are a number of ways of doing this, but in the first instance, if you remember the capacity limitations of working memory, that will take you a long way. So your question now is, all right, how? It was, wasn't it? Let's look at a couple of examples that demonstrate principles that you can apply to slides, documents, e-learning materials, and videos. Here's a more standard way of delivering the information about George Miller's paper on the magical number. So you could have a point introducing the magical number and so on, till we get through all 5 points. Now, if you really want your audience to have all this text, please give it to them on a handout or email a PDF document to them as a follow-up reminder after your session. But please, avoid inflicting this sort of thing on them. Now, having said that, I do know that some organisations can be inflexible about presentation styles. In a separate video, I cover ways of dealing with slides containing too many chunks when it's unavoidable. In this case, though, for example, if you're forced to use lots of words on a slide, try highlighting the key words. Then you can work with the screen and direct people's attention to the highlighted words as you go through each particular point you want to make. A word of warning though, colour won't necessarily work for everyone. Remember, some people are colourblind. So even better, remove as many words as you can, or are allowed to, and aim to keep the number of bullet points to 7 or fewer. Here we have just 5. This of course means that the presenter has to do more work explaining the slide, telling related stories if relevant, and making the slide meaningful. However, here's the point. The reason for having a presenter or facilitator in the room, or online these days, is to bring the material to life, make it memorable, and help people learn from it. And that doesn't happen if someone just reads out a whole heap of text. Let's look at one more simple example. Design elements can be used to manage attention, make the experience enjoyable, and make the material memorable. Here is a list of some of the elements. As you can see, presented like this, they're just a meaningless list. But let's rearrange them. That probably feels better already, doesn't it? Very quickly, your brain will recognize that there seems to be some relationship between the items in each group. With the previous slide, your brain would have been working overtime to try to sort out if there were any meaningful relationships in the list. But we can do better than this. Let's highlight each group as we present it. Here, the focus is on the design elements relating to layout. And here, it's on colour and its applications. Here, it's on features of text. And here, it's on attributes that make things like animations meaningful and useful. And when each group has been discussed, you can show the whole lot to remind people how much they have covered. But still, we can do even better. The world has enough bullet points already. Now, to be fair, they can be very useful, but the organisation we've chosen for this slide means that they're just more stuff your brain has to process, and that can impede learning. In this case, there is absolutely no need for them. Is there? But we do have to help people distinguish the headings, so let's do that. Okay, so now the slide is becoming more meaningful. The headings are in bold, and in fact, they are a slightly different colour. But remember that something like 9% of males have some form of colour blindness and about 4% of females do. When you want to use colour to distinguish something, you should also use some other attribute as well. Let's try this. And now, a subtle but important adjustment. Now the boxes are distributed evenly. Even if people don't consciously notice the slight uneven spacing on the previous slide, it's still stuff for their working memory to process. Now we have a more meaningful layout, and if you were presenting these, it would be better to present each box separately like this. Say what you need to say about the layout group, and then about the colour group, and then about how features of text can help an experience of learning, and how to make animations meaningful and informative. And still remember to let your audience see what you've covered at the end. So, please keep the magical number in mind when designing your presentations and trainings and organising the content into chunks that can be held in working memory. Thank you for taking the time to view this video. I do hope it's been helpful to you and that you've enjoyed it as well. I can be contacted via my website displayed on screen, and thank you again for joining me.